Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK Killer, killed 10 people in and around Wichita, Kansas. He was known to be very brazen and would break into people's houses and kill them. Dennis Rader gave himself the nickname BTK Killer, and that stands for bind, torture, and kill. He was so brazen that he even sent in numerous letters and tapes to the police over the years. Spanning like 15 years, he sent in letters and tapes bragging about all the kills he committed as BTK. So the whole time he was murdering people, he was married to a lady named Paula Dietz. They were married from 1971 up until his arrest in 2005. They had 2 children together and even attended the same church for about 30 years. So we'll go check out all the houses where he killed all the people, check out the church that they attended at, and then finally show you guys the house that Dennis Rader and his wife Paula and their 2 kids lived at. The house is now torn down, but I'll show you, of course, where it was. So not only was Dennis Rader a family man, a churchgoer for 30 years, and he also served in the U.S. Air Force from 1966 to 1970. So from all outward appearances, he was a loving family man, church-going guy, military veteran. So it goes to show that some people can really just hide their true evil selves. January 15th, 1974, the Otero family was murdered in their house. The house is located at 803 North Edgemore Street in Wichita, Kansas. The Otero family, which consisted of Julie Otero, who was 35, her husband, Joseph Otero, who was 38, their 5 children, Charlie Otero, who was 15, Danny Otero, who was 14, Carmen, who was 13, Josephine, who was 11, and Joseph Jr., who was 9. So Dennis broke into the home around 7 or 7:30 a.m., and he already had with him his quote-unquote kill kit. And that consisted of basically like his guns he had, his cords, knives, and other tools to help him break in. One of his trademarks was that he would cut the phone line before breaking into the house. That kind of became one of his trademarks he would do. That way, of course, the family, if anyone was there, they couldn't call the police. So after he broke in, he was only expecting to see the wife, Julie, and 2 of the kids. Quickly realized that the husband, Joseph Otero, was also home. He quickly took out his gun he had and basically just told the family that he was a wanted fugitive and that he was there needing food, money, and a car. He basically forced them into a bedroom, tied their hands and feet together. He strangled the wife, Julie, first. Then moving on to the husband, Joseph, he put a plastic bag over Joseph's head and then tying it with a cord to make sure that he was dead. He did the same thing to Joseph Jr. Unfortunately, the worst came for Josephine, the 11-year-old, whom Dennis took down to the basement and hung her by a pipe and ended up leaving some of his DNA, his semen, behind. What makes this case even more tragic was the fact that the 3 other siblings, the 15-year-olds, the 14-year-old, and 13-year-old, all of them were, of course, not home at the time. They were all in school. Those 3 came back from school, entered the home, and they found their parents and their other 2 siblings all killed. April 4th, 1974, Catherine Bright, 24 years old, was killed. She was killed at her house at 3217 East 13th Street North. Dennis had actually seen Catherine Bright before she entered her house and kind of stalked her in a sense before he ended up breaking in. So the day of the murder, he of course broke into the house
through a porch door, and he hid in the bedroom, waiting for her to come back. She arrived home around 2 p.m. with her brother Kevin, who was 19. Dennis was not expecting anyone else to be there. He thought it would just be Catherine. When he heard them come into the house, he rushed out of the bedroom with his gun and told them basically the same kind of story, that he was a wanted criminal and he needed like food and money and stuff. He forced them into the bedroom and ordered Kevin to tie up his own sister. He then took Kevin into the other room and tried tying him up as well. It wasn't really working though, and so Kevin and Dennis actually ended up getting into a fight or struggle, and Dennis ended up shooting Kevin. He shot him twice in the head, but thankfully Kevin was able to survive. He was able to escape. Catherine, unfortunately, wasn't so lucky. She did try putting up a fight after him strangling her. Wasn't really working, so he ended up stabbing her to death.
March 16th, 1977, 24-year-old Shirley Via. She was murdered at her house, located at 1311 South Hydraulic Avenue.
And in this particular case, Dennis was actually kind of stalking a different woman named Cheryl, whom he actually met at a bar, but she wasn't home at the time. So he ended up driving down Hydraulic Street here and ended up coming in contact with a little kid, a 5-year-old named Stephen Relford. Dennis showed the 5-year-old a picture of Dennis's own wife and son, and asked the little boy if he knew where they were, kind of as a ruse to say like, hey, I'm looking for my wife and my son. And of course the little boy said no, and he went back home. Dennis watched to see which home the little boy went to, and he ended up coming back and knocking on the door. The same little boy, Stephen, answered the door, but this time Dennis posed as a detective and kind of was able to get into the house that way. There was 3 other children in the house, including Stephen. Dennis turned off the TV that was on, and that is when Shirley, the mother, came out and of course was startled to see this random stranger in her house. Dennis had his gun out and ordered the children into a bathroom, and he locked them inside. Meanwhile, Dennis was talking to Shirley and trying to calm her down, stating that that he wouldn't rape her or kill her or anything, and gave her a cigarette and water, and kind of was just hanging out with her for a little bit. Of course, Dennis was lying. He ended up tying her up, strangling her, and ended up leaving more DNA evidence, more semen, on her panties that were there. They were found next to her body. The children that were locked up in the bathroom were very, very close to also being killed. And kind of one of the main reasons why they were spared was the telephone rang, causing Dennis to leave after he killed Shirley. If it wasn't for the telephone ringing, it was very probable that Dennis would have ended up killing all of them.
That is Shirley's house, or that was her house, I guess I should say. December 7th, 1977, 25-year-old Nancy Fox was killed in her home. Her home is located at 843 South Pershing Street.
Dennis cut the phone lines, broke into her duplex from the back door. He waited in her home for her to get back from her job that she worked at, which was a jewelry store. And so, of course, Dennis must have stalked her for quite some time because he knew where she worked and he knew that she lived alone. When she arrived, of course, he startled her, held her there at gunpoint. He told her that he had a sexual issue and that he needed to kind of get rid of that issue. So she followed Dennis's orders by taking off her clothes and being tied up in the bedroom. While he was strangling her, he actually was confessing to her, who he actually was. Once again, Dennis left some more DNA evidence, more semen, next to her body. Dennis worked many different jobs, including as a code enforcement officer, but he also worked at an alarm company called ADT, which is a pretty famous company. The following day after killing Nancy Fox, on the way to his job at the ADT alarm company, he called the local police department and said that, hey, you guys are going to find a homicide at, the residence of Nancy Fox.
April 26th, 1985, 53-year-old Marlene Hedge, which actually was Dennis's neighbor. He lived literally right down the street from her. Her house was located at 6254 Independence Street. Dennis's house was located at 6220 Independence Street.
By the time that Dennis decided to commit another murder in 1985, his own children were getting older and they were actually in the Boy Scouts. And so Dennis actually ended up becoming a Boy Scout leader. And on this particular murder, on April 27th, 1985, Dennis was in the middle of a Boy Scout meeting when he was claiming that he had a bad headache and that he had to leave to go get some sort of medicine to help with that. He ended up walking to his car that was parked at a nearby bowling alley and went inside and bought a beer and was drinking some beer and intentionally spilled some beer on his clothes to make it look like he had been drinking heavily, and that anyone who was there kind of as a witness would see that, oh, this guy must be just drunk or something. So he ended up calling for a taxi, of course pretending to be drunk, and the taxi took him to Park City, which is where he lived, and of course the same neighborhood that his next victim, Marlene Hedge, lived at. Once he got to Marine's home, her car was parked there, and so he just assumed that she was already home. He again cut the phone line as per usual and ended up opening the back door. He was able to sneak in and wait in her bedroom. She ended up arriving home around 1 a.m. or so. That was when he jumped out and ended up strangling her there in her bedroom. And so this is what is interesting. He ended up taking her body outside, putting her body inside the trunk, and driving her to the church, the same church he had been going to for dozens of years. So he ended up driving her to the church here. He was given keys to the church, and so he was able to go into the church with the dead body of Marlene here. Ended up taking her down to the basement of the church and ended up basically taking a lot of pictures of her dead body in different poses before he dumped her body near the house back in Park City.
On September 15th, 1986, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerly was killed in her house, and her house was located at 2404 West 13th Street North.
Vicki Wegerly, she was a mother of two. She was being stalked by Dennis, and Dennis had seen her as he would walk by her house, and he ended up hearing her play piano, and so that kind of caught his attention, and he decided that she was going to be the next victim. Around 10 a.m. or so on September 16th, Dennis dressed up as a telephone repairman and knocked on her door. Of course, at that point, he had already cut her telephone line, so it was one of those kind of perfect ruses because her phone line was already not working. And so when he came as a telephone repairman, she was like, oh, great, my phone isn't working and this guy's going to come help fix it. So again, once at gunpoint, he forced her into the bedroom. She tried her best to fight him off and actually ended up scratching him several times, but unfortunately Dennis overpowered her, tied her up, and choked her to death. And then he ended up stealing her car. Her husband, named Bill, saw their own car drive by him, and he obviously knew that it wasn't his wife driving the car, so he was very suspicious. He ended up going home and saw that their 2-year-old son was alone by himself, and ended up finding his wife's dead body in the bedroom.
Dennis's last murder was of 62-year-old Dolores Davis on January 18th, 1991. Her house was at 6226 North Hillside Street.
Again, Dennis was doing activities with the Boy Scouts on this day. He was camping with the Boy Scouts, with his children and the Boy Scouts over that weekend. He somehow made up an excuse to leave, which was pretty weird. Somehow he was able to just say, hey, I need to go, leaving his children and, you know, whoever else was there in the Boy Scouts. He left all of them, drove to his parents' house where he was able to change out of his Boy Scout uniform and into like normal clothes. He then once again drove to his church. He then parked his car at the church, the same church he went to, and walked over to the house of Dolores Davis, 62 years old. He broke the glass door, the back of the house, and went in. Dolores came out of her bedroom and saw Dennis standing there. Again, he used the same line that, oh, hey, you know, he was a fugitive needing money and car and food, and that, you know, he was going to tie her up. So he, of course, tied her up and ended up strangling her as well in her bedroom. He took her dead body, put her also in the trunk, and ended up dumping her body nearby in a lake in Park City. He went back, of course, wiped down any evidence, fingerprints, and then eventually dumped her body in a final resting place, which was underneath a bridge. He then was able to go back, change into his Boy Scout uniform again, and go back to the camping spot with where his kids and the other Boy Scout leaders were. And apparently no one really questioned anything about why he first left in the first place, what he was doing while he left.
All right, guys, so right in front of me is Dennis Rader's old homestead where he lived with his wife and 2 children. Again, the house is now torn down, but I figured I'm here in the area, so I'll show you. This is where his house used to be. On February 16th, 2005, Dennis sent the police a floppy disk containing more information and evidence pertaining to the murders. In the request, Dennis asked the police, would this floppy disk be traceable? Would they be able to pull back any information from it that would lead back to him? I can't believe Dennis asked them that, and of course the police said, no, that's not traceable. Of course it was traceable. Once the police received the floppy disk with all the information and some crime scene photos, police dug further into the floppy disk and found a file containing 3 words, Christ Lutheran Church, and then another word, Dennis. They did some searches online and traced the church and the name back to Dennis Rader, who of course attended the church here, Christ Lutheran Church. It took a long time, but eventually he was finally caught after his last time he sent in a letter or tape. He was apprehended on February 25th, 2005. At the end of his murder spree, Dennis Rader killed 10 people, and again, as his moniker stated, he would bind, torture, and kill them. Just terrible terrible, especially when you consider how he appeared on the outside. As I mentioned, just super charming, nice, married, church-going guy, but underneath he was a super evil man.